Good morning, everyone. What happened totally overcame his conscience. It was something that was unexpected. This fact was going beyond everything. It was a presence entering the world. What's the meaning of this historical event called Francis for the world and for the church? Today, we, men and women of the 21st century, ask ourselves this question. Where does this wisdom come from? And where does this novelty come from? Novelty that questions us all. Why is he speaking like that? And why does he make those gestures and pronounces those words that leave us mesmerized? To answer these questions, we are here with Mr. Guzman Carriquiry from Uruguay. Then we have somebody coming from Britain who's got a passion for Argentina and who find out a lot of things in Argentina, Austen Ivereigh. And then we have two participants from Italy who are charmed by Pope Francis's figure. John Paul II, especially for Mr. Buttiglione, Rocco Buttiglione. And then Mr. Massimo Borghesi, who's been fascinated by Pope Francis. Now, we'll try to explore the Pope's personality. Jorge Mario Bergoglio up to Pope Francis and his 5 years of pontificate. Now, we shall start by giving the floor to Guzman Carriquiry, who has had the privilege was that his two most important books, one dedicated to Latin America, designed by his historical self-awareness, The Great Opportunity of Latin America, with an introduction by Jorge Mario Bergoglio. And then his second book, Memory, Courage, and Hope, with an introduction by Bergoglio. And then, in the new edition, an introduction by Pope Francis. I give you the floor.
Good morning, everyone. To all the friends of the meeting here, I feel at home among relatives, particularly so because I have here with me my beloved nephew, Francesco Saverio. If we look at the last 50 years after the Second Vatican Council, we cannot help but marvel for the succession of popes with different biographies, coming from different cultural realities, with the different characters, backgrounds, visions, and styles, so that each of them is defined as the right person to satisfy the needs of the church in the different times of human history. And it is thanks to these different personalities that the Spirit of God is shaping the solid continuity of the great Catholic tradition and the faith heritage that comes from the testimony of the apostles through the successors of Peter, which actually makes us marvel for its novelty in this continuity. A succession of saints, successors of Peter, Saint John the 23rd, the soon-to-be Saint Paul the Sixth, the instance that has already been submitted for John Paul I, Saint John Paul II, and now the emeritus Pope Benedict XVI, and today's Pope Francis. However, the devil, who is the king of division and lies, manipulates the poor souls that want to compare and contrast the following popes. It cannot allow the Spirit to reign, since it always strengthens unity through diversity. I still remember the great surprise generated by the first non-Italian pope after centuries. There were poor souls that at the beginning contemptuously called Karol Wojtyla the Polish pope, whereas those who relied on the action of the Spirit tried to know him better, his biography, his background, the church and the nation he came from, his philosophical teachings, his intervention in the Vatican Council II, and his work as Archbishop of Krakow. They wanted to know him better to strengthen their emotional and effective connection to with the new Pope. And many of us remember how much we owe to this Pope who taught us the history of Poland with its great prelates, poets, theologians, and guardians of human dignity. The Study Center for Eastern Europe, Father Francesco Ricci, and Rocco Buttiglione with his book, The Thought of Karol Wojtyla. And then there was another great news, that is to say, the election of Jorge Mario Bergoglio. That was the first time that the Pope was not European. He was the son of the Catholic tradition embedded in the history and life of Latin America, where about 50% of all Catholics live, of a church of a people who lived in a fruitful and turbulent way, the innovation brought about by the Second Vatican Council to serve his people, and carried out a great work of understanding and spreading up to his maturity, which was expressed in the Fifth General Conference of Latin American Bishops in Aparecida. And along this path, the Providence led Jorge Mario Bergoglio to Rome. Yesterday, we listened to the words of Monsignor Christopher Pierre in his intervention. So there are so many different links among the Aparecida document and the exhortation Evangelii Gaudium, which is the programming document of these 5 years of pontificate. So he is a Catholic that is a porteño, very porteño. He is Argentinian, very Argentinian. He is Latin American, very Latin American. And he is Jesuit, and he's so Jesuit because he's been chosen to become the shepherd, the universal shepherd, and this make us think that we can reach universality only by starting on from one's peculiarities. If we take into account that the countries with the highest number of baptized Catholics are Brazil and Mexico, followed by the Philippines and the United States, and in a few years, Congo, Colombia, Argentina and Nigeria will exceed some European countries, where Italy is the only country that still resists. Well, we can say that the periphery of the church is now becoming the stronghold of the church, embedding its faith in the life of people with the different forms of culture. And this is the beauty of a church with different faces, as Pope Francis wrote. And this, in a way, is still surprising for those who still believe that the Catholic Church and the Catholic faith has to be considered only through European criteria. I would like to thank those who sit here with me at this table, because among the great wave of books written on the pontificate of Pope Francis really helped us with their excellent studies to know Jorge Mario Bergoglio better, in order to be more faithful to today's Pope. My book, which has, well, whose prologues, whose introduction was written by the Pope, is not as excellent as their books. And we would like to thank also the organizers of the exhibition that shows that tells us about the life of Bergoglio in a very, well, in an extraordinary way. These studies help us understand that Pope Francis is a real Latin American. But at the same time, we can say that he is European, because he is the son of migrants from Piedmont and has his roots in the expansion of European Christianity. And because he is the citizen of Latin America, which can be called the Far West, and because he studied the authors and the schools of European Catholic thought that were so important for the teaching of the Second Vatican Council. And he was also Archbishop of a big metropolis, that is to say, the most Europeanized metropolis in Latin America. We can say that in this moment of European barrenness, demographic, cultural, and political barrenness, this great legacy that the European Christianity passed on to Latin America has taken up a new shape through this new Pope, and it actually is based on the tradition and the culture and the life of Europeans. And I believe that this relationship is the challenge and the backbone of today's Catholicism, whereas, as I can say this, the Church of the United States is very, very vital, but still too parochial, and it is too young in a way. And there are so many other churches in Africa and in other Asian countries that are also too young, so to speak. So with Monsignor Christopher Pierre, we will continue to underline that this pontificate helped us to better understand the mystery of mercy. It is clear that this primary attribute of God, which is at the center of the salvation plan, has always been considered considered by previous popes, but today it appears even in a clearer way, because it is the right way to live and pass on the Christian event, because we are aware of the misery that we Christians bring with us in the awareness, as the Apostle Paul used to say, that we have been treated with mercy, to live it among ourselves, because to be the right testimonies of this mercy, this pontificate calls upon us for a new conversion, a new way to meet Christ, letting him, our life to be imbued in the with the evangel of Jesus Christ, to become real disciples of the Lord, and to transmit mercy to this humanity with its misery, that has to be transmitted then in a way that will help us to approach men and women that are often far removed from the church, without excluding anybody, because God's love does not exclude anyone, and without preconditions for this meeting with Christ. Pope Francis is convinced that only the concrete closeness of this merciful love can actually overcome prejudice and resistance, and it is attractive. It opens up hearts, and it gives a new opportunity for a real dialogue with real exchanges, and it opens for the announcement of the gospel. And this mercy is, in a way, the heart that embraces the poor. We know that we are blessed to see the everyday testimony of this shepherd who kneels in front of the poor, and that recognizes from people's suffering the second Eucharist of the Lord, among the so many people that are vulnerable, that are excluded in a society that is becoming more and more indifferent. Yesterday, we heard about this pastoral conversion, seen as an in capita and in membris reform, because the church needs to be more faithful and closer to its Lord. So I would like to understand that pastoral conversion means to convert the bishops and the clergymen. Pope Francis asks for the conversion of the Pope, and tells us what he awaits from the clergymen, and as shepherds of a whole people. So this conversion can become more and more difficult, but there are so many situations that are experienced within the church that involved priests in terrible crimes. So these situations often have roots in the past, at the beginning of the after council period, but reached the pontificate of Pope Ratzinger and Pope Bergoglio, in a way creating and endangering the solidity of the church. Everything that has to do with the background, the support of the priests from the very first moment that they recognize their own vocation to the moment they really become priests. This is a very important problem the church has to deal with. Maybe God's providence wants us to overcome this terrible, difficult period in order to arrive to a great period of purification from the point of view of the clergy. At the same time, the great powers that that are in a way discreet but are always there and have a great power of persuasion, make us and make people like the Inquisition for those who hate the church. So I'm convinced that we, in spite of all our misery, the Catholic Church is the real alternative for human salvation that is still part of a world that is controlled by inhuman powers. And this is where we find the Church and, above all, the Pope, who helps those who have been wounded in their soul and in their bodies to safeguard the dignity of the human being and to encourage the desire of love and truth, of happiness in the life of men and people, and to give a testimony of the Savior against the idols of power, money, and pleasure. So let's not forget that mundane power will thrive on our misery, and when it will meet with real Christians, it will make even more martyrs. That is why Pope Francis is already warning us, and we see that in his apostolic exhortation, and I quote, "In this continuous fight against the devil, who is the king of evil," so he gives us the certainty that the Lord, the resurrected, will win in the end.
Ahora continuamos con Rocco Buttiglione.
And now we will continue with Mr. Rocco Buttiglione, who will help us to talk about John Paul II pontificate and Pope Francis's pontificate.
Grazie Alejandro. Grazie a tutti voi.
Thank you, Alejandro, and thank you to all of you. There's people today, as recently said by Guzman, talking about the division of the Church and wants to compare John Paul II pontificate to Pope Francis's pontificate. But I do believe that there's continuity between the two. When John Paul II was elected, the first thing he did was going to Latin America. Even before going to Poland, the first pilgrimage by John Paul II was to Puebla in Latin America. In Puebla, John Paul II talked about the great topic of liberation theology. And he gave an answer to that. This answer was not immediately understood by everyone. But it was understood by a group of Latin American intellectuals and theologians. There were also some Italians among them, Juan Carlos Cannone, Jorge Mario Bergoglio, who then was the rector of San Miguel Seminary, and Alberto Metol-Ferré, as well as Guzman Carriquiry. And then there were a couple of Italians, Mr. Francesco Ricci and myself. Father Francesco Ricci, and myself. Nexo magazine was designed at that time in order to support John Paul II in Latin America. What did he say? He said that the idea of a liberation theology was a good idea. The idea of a theology starting from the experience of faith of the Latin American people and the Latin American poor is the right idea. Why so? Because the Christian event only happened once, 2,000 years ago, in Palestine. It's an apax legomenon, as the Bible would say. It just occurred once. And it always reoccurs in the history of the church, and in the people's history, where national churches are created. Think about the great teachings of the Second Vatican Council. The church is one, is universal, and is concrete in the life of each country, each city, each diocese, each parish, each family. Thinking about faith, starting from the experience of the Latin American people, is right. That was the great novelty of the theology of liberation. What was wrong? The idea that faith is not enough for a judgment, but then you have to connect to Marxism in order to give judgment. This is wrong. Faith does not have analytical tools. It does a sort of metacritics, as the Germans would say. It's not an ipse dixit. Karol Wojtyła was Polish, and he knew that Marxism had already failed. We didn't know that in the West, but he knew that. He had already seen that with his own eyes. Now, these groups wanted to continue spreading John Paul II's message in Puebla, and they got together. They created a network of friendships. The idea was to disseminate a theology of liberation, and I quote John Paul II, in the style of communion and liberation. At that time, for us, of this group, of this movement, Communion and Liberation, it was a wonderful time. I remember the meeting that we had here, Americas. It was a very important moment for us. I remember that when I went to Buenos Aires, and we met with that group, and the Argentinians were listening to all the news that Richard and I brought from Poland with great attention, because they had this idea that just like Solidarność was shaking an empire, which then collapsed, and that was the Soviet Empire, at the same time, at the periphery of the Western Empire, there used to be a big movement. There had to be a big movement of communion and liberation to free man, a movement which had the same ability, although it was totally different situations, but they could be compared because the faith rooted on charity can awaken people's conscience. John Paul II talked to the sleepy conscience of the peoples in Western Europe and Central Europe, and history changed. Since then, Jorge Mario Bergoglio had a great desire, talking to the conscience of the Latin American people in order to stir a movement of resurrection of the Christian faith of these countries, of these peoples. It was a totally new idea of people. What is the people? We talked about people's theology, the theology of peoples. What's that? The theology of the people is understanding the fact that God enters history in practice. Each one of us is a believer, has faith, because it is enshrined in the history of the real church. The Church of Rimini had its martyr, its founders, its fathers, its mothers, saints, priests, who fed the memory of an experience of liberation, the experience lived by the disciples with Jesus, which is repeated. And the conscience of the people turns to sleep, and it needs to be awakened. A great friend of Jorge Mario Bergoglio, Alberto Metolferre, talked about the Catholic Latin American Risorgimento, meaning that the memory of the people, of the man, had to be awakened. And that happened when Guadalupe Virgin Mary appeared, and from then the continent was converted. All the big fighters for freedom and justice, the defenders of Indio, the Motolina, Santa Rosa de Lima, that is the criterion. Starting from there, there is a judgment on history mobilizing a people. And then the people's conscience falls to sleep and needs to be awakened. The people is a sort of context, environment. As Father Giussani said, in order to be mobilized, the environment needs to have a smaller environment, as in the Christian community, calling for the truth of man. Hence, the nation, the country, the people is animated by the Eucharistic will living inside the people's life. The people regularly falls asleep. Do you know the history of the Israeli people? It's a people that falls asleep in daily life and forgets the original liberation. The church has the task to awaken it and to make the people live and experience the Eucharisty. This is why John Paul II talked about communion liberation. The ontological communion had to become a real community and had to generate new forms of life, more human forms of life for man. Now, if we understand that, we can understand the continuity between the two pontificates. Talking to Aparecida document, and then, we know that Jorge Mario Bergoglio became the auxiliary bishop in Buenos Aires when Monsignor Guaracino came up. This group of intellectuals was grouped in the Commission of Consultants of the General Conference of the Latin American Episcopate. When Guaracino went to Buenos Aires, he called Jorge Mario Bergoglio to help him. Then he became the Bishop of Buenos Aires, and he led not just the Argentinian church, but all the Latin American church, continuing Puebla up to Aparecida de Norci, based on the idea that the church is the soul of the people's life, and church can live in a continuous dialogue with the people. And that embraces all, even those who don't go to Mass on Sunday, even those who think are not Christians, because it is the memory of their own identity. It is their own identity. But in order to do that, the church needs to be close to the poor. What does it mean to be close to the poor? This is what San Carlo Borromeo said when he was talking about parishes. Parish means para oikia, near the house. This word is not far from the man's heart. It is a word close to any man. And how can you say that to the poor if you are not close to the poor, if you don't share the poor's experience? And that creates the Christian community based on taking care of the poor. People were intimate to one another, more than brothers and sisters. Why should we not worry about the poor, about the people who don't have a house, who cannot drink or eat, who cannot take care of their children? This is mankind as a whole that has to take care of the poor. And in practice, it is our community. And this is the theology of the people, the people's theology. And this is a brand new idea. Every word is reconnected to the Ecumenic Council of the Second Vatican Council. Faith becoming culture and becoming life. Becoming culture in order to become life. Meaning culture, self-conscious. What is the force moving the world? Some people think about politics, military forces. Karl Marx said something different. He said, under the politics and under military forces, there's the history of economy, the way people make their living and make their wealth. But the Second Vatican Council, in the Second Vatican Council, John Paul II, Pope Francis knows something more than that. The forces moving the world is the conscience that the people have, that man has of itself, because the energy comes from our heart, comes from the idea that we have of ourselves. It is an idea, this is the idea that we have of ourselves, generating energy to wake up in the morning, to go work, and not for yourself, but for your wife, for your children, for your husband, which generates the energy in order to tackle sufferings, pain, death. And this is an idea, and I chose the word idea, which maybe doesn't say everything, because it's not just an idea, it is an energy of life entering the heart of some, and through them can be communicated, conveyed to others. This is the life of the church. The life of the church means sharing this faith, which is called grace, concrete grace. I met some people whom I was impressed by and moved in my heart, just like when I met the girl who then became my wife. The meeting with her gave me energy of life. So I became able to do something which I couldn't do beforehand. This is the idea of the theology of the people, where the Eucharisty is at the heart of the people's life. This energy of life conveyed to some and then to many, and feeding the people, nurturing the people. This generates unity. Unity which does not deny contradictions, but which is stronger than contradictions. This is one of the great principles by Pope Francis. Unity is stronger than divisions. I remember that in my group of friends, we used to quote a writer which is not very popular in Europe, General Peron, who once said, "There's no better thing for an Argentinian than another Argentinian." At the time when Argentinians were killing one another, there was a civil war in Argentina at that time. Every time I hear the Pope saying that unity is stronger than division, I remember those words. Saying that the other, my opponent, is my brother. We can argue, but even political fight, even contradiction, can never forget that the other is my brother. And while they were killing each other, the colonels against the others, Bergoglio was wanted to have the people's unity. The colonels and the others wanted to divide the Argentinian people for two groups to kill each other. On the contrary, the people agreeing with Bergoglio and also others in the Latin American church were the people who wanted to protect the people's unity, because this is the expression of the Eucharistic ability. Many people shed their blood for that. I didn't read my text, so I don't know if I still have time to continue. How much time still I have? Okay. I'm going to conclude. There was somebody who was killed, Monsignor Angelelli. He was a great friend of Bergoglio. He was murdered by the colonels. And the colonels then pretended that it was a road accident. And I was struck because this is what the Polish colonels wanted to do when they killed the Pope Eusko. The power is very similar in itself at any time and in any country. There's no fantasy in power. One of the first things that Jorge Mario Bergoglio, when he became Pope, was starting the beatification of Monsignor Angelelli. We remember him, but also many others who fought the same way. This is why they were so interested in Solidarność when we went to speak to them. Not because they wanted to destroy their enemies, but because they wanted to state their dignity. But because they wanted to state that their opponents were brothers. They wanted to remember about human solidarity, because the murderer, the tyrant, first of all, destroys its own soul, and it is an unhappy man which does not believe in the unity of the people, which, on the contrary, is a source of energy for us all. To conclude, let me remind two Bergoglio's prophets. When I was young, nobody believed in a Latin American pope. I didn't either. And there were only two people whom I met who were really convinced that after the Polish pope, there would be a Latin American pope. One of them was Alberto Metov Ferrer. Some of you remember him because he came to that meeting, Americas, I mentioned before. And the other one was Father Francesco Ricci, who was a great witness of that idea of communion and liberation that also charmed John Paul II, and which it joins this idea of the theology of the people, which needs to be built, but Pope Francis bears witness to that. And in full continuity with his great predecessor, John Paul II.
Thank you very much. So we had this introduction by Guzman and Rocco. And we now leave the floor to Austen Ivereigh from Great Britain. And, well, he talked about us, Argentinians, Latin Americans, as only a few ever did. His analysis is born in an empirical mind that could analyze us, my people, in a very objective way in the cultural background we are experiencing now in Latin America. It enabled us to look at our reality free from any ideology. And particularly, it was focusing on who is Jorge Mario Bergoglio. So he will help us understand what Jorge Mario Bergoglio did and how he became Pope Francis. It's a great pleasure for me to be here today among these friends. My Italian is not really bad, but it would be more merciful for all of you if I speak my Argentinian Spanish with the same accent as the Pope. So I will carry on in Spanish. And I will talk about what an Italian commentator called the Chiali encyclical, with reference to the speech in Santiago in January and the following letters sent to the bishops on the crisis experienced in that country. I think this is a very important lesson to understand the wider crisis that we are experiencing in the United States at the moment, following the episodes of sexual harassment. And in the Aparecida document, it is said that it has been acknowledged that the main danger of the church comes from within, in the subtle temptation of closure in order to feel protected and safe, end of quotation. So these are more or less the same words that were used in the letter to the Chinese bishops when they were invited to Rome for the crisis. You will remember this letter because the Pope asked to be forgiven in a very humble way for his own mistakes and for the interpretation of the church in Chile on the basis of the lacking information that he had at his disposal. And he said that in these difficult moments, now that we are afraid and closed up in our winter palaces, the love of God comes to us and purifies our intentions to let us love with the free, wise, critical man. This idea of being closed up in our comfortable winter buildings and palaces is the powerful expression of a church that is afraid and that has problems in carrying out his task of evangelization. And these words can be found also in another work by Bergoglio on Doroteo of Gaza called The Accusation of Oneself. Bergoglio does not quote directly this text, but it is clear that the criteria he uses for the crisis in Chile are the same. And there is another work of the same period quoted in his speech in Santiago in January, that is to say, a preface that Bergoglio wrote in a book which was then published in 1987 and is entitled The Letters of Tribulation. And these are the letters written by the Company of Jesus at the end of the 18th century when this association was cancelled. So they have a common subtle perception of the suffering of religious parties in front of this tribulation, which could lead to the loss of the Christian culture, the secularization, or the result of the institutional failure of the church, as we saw in the cases of sexual harassment, and in a combination of both elements would also be the answer. Temptations can be summarized in a double trend, so to speak. Instead of understanding and reforming, as it should be done during conversion, the church closes up and looks at those who attacks it as enemies, and they are called evil, and we are the good ones. So, this is a big mistake because the church provides an intellectual response to a spiritual attack. So it is, if the faith is not presented as a meeting, an encounter, a person, but rather like an ethical proposal. So the temptation is to present the truth without charity, or vice versa. And this is what Massimo Borghesi identifies in his beautiful book, his latest book, as a deviation, an ethical deviation that has characterized Catholicism in the time of globalization. Starting from the 80s. In this deviation, the encounter with the God of mercy, which is in a way at the basis of the foundation of the church, is neglected in favor of some kind of defensive moralism, which, as Borghesi says, is a strategy of resistance. But this cannot lead to a rebirth. It doesn't communicate the truth of Christianity that, as Benedict XVI said, it is not, because it is not an idea, but rather a person that can change your horizon. And this is a quote that can be found also in the Aparecida document, where Pope Francis says he will continue repeating this quote because it takes us to the heart of the gospel, and it is present again in Papite Deo in February, which is against agnosticism, and again it appears in the message of the Pope to the meeting. So it is really a key concept. We could sum up Francis' pontificate as the effort to, so to speak, free the church from its agnosticism so that it can go back to the real relationship between Jesus and his father, Abba, as the basis of our Christianity. What we can find in this document in Chile is a roadmap for countries like Chile and our own countries, and in a way, attachment to success, money, and power. Those spiritual defined as honor is combined with an incredible institutional failure, in particular with reference to the sexual harassment perpetrated by clergymen. So Pope Francis talks about the invite of the Holy Spirit to embrace this way of tribulation, this humiliation. It is in a way an invitation to pastoral conversion, an invitation we can either accept or resist. Through failures and through the suffering of the church, God comes to us to help us change. And as it happens in our own private lives, these failures are opportunities of growth and conversion. And this is the passage to which the Pope invites us in a series of profound interventions that can be called the Chilean encyclical. And then, well, on the 16th of January, he held a speech in the Cathedral of Santiago. And then there was a first letter to the Bishop of Chile in April, after he received Monsignor Segluna's report. The second letter, 15th of May, he gave the bishops from Chile when they arrived in Rome. And then the third for God's people in Chile at the end of May. These interventions represent, in a way, a passage from some form of a situation that could be compared to that of a woman that cannot even move, to a fertile mother who lives to help her children. So in his speech before his election in March 2013, he gave kind of the same guidelines to the bishops and the cardinals. And the fil rouge of these documents is the example that Pope Francis gives, that is to say, the transfiguration of Peter from disciple to apostle. So when Jesus forgives Peter, who betrayed him, Peter opens up to this mercy and becomes, from desperate man, as he was at the end of St. John's Gospel, to become the healer and the shepherd that we find at the beginning of the new Gospels. So there is a first part where Peter is sitting there concentrating on his mistakes and on his prosecutors, but then there is a passage and he starts concentrating on Jesus, on what is outside. So this is a very important change of perspective towards evangelization. So there is a decentralization this uh, in this kind of meeting with our faith. And I quote the Pope: "A wounded church is not at the center. It doesn't believe to be perfect. The only one who can heal these wounds is Jesus Christ." So we need to go through that phase of desperation, like Peter, to then be saved. We have to move from a church of desperate people to a church that can serve those who are suffering. So this is what the Pope said to the bishops in Chile, but to us as well. These tools that are in a way sophisticated can be found in these works from the 80s on desolation and tribulation suffered by Jesuits in Argentina. And I would like to underline 3 main points. Pope Francis says that the tribulation generated by secularization, well, the bishops did not reform. They complained, they condemned, and thus they made it possible for the evil spirit to win, because there is an approach that is based on defense. So there are the responsibility is given is attributed to others, but this doesn't work because there are problems that are rooted within the church, and then the bishops started to blame each other, and so it's like the world is divided into villains and heroes, and everyone is a victim in the end. The second point, in the Santiago speech, the Pope quotes the tribulation letters. There are so many temptations at this time to discuss ideas, and I quote, "We discuss ideas, but we do not focus on the real situation. We focus on the prosecutors, and we reflect too much upon desolation." And when he talks about discussing idea, he talks about the temptation to fall into the trap of discussing rather than understanding. In this letter, he refers to this point. We need to defend the truth, and we need to defend the charity. And this is, in a way, what has been done lately. So there are 2 different trends. In any case, the temptation is rooted in discussing rather than understanding and reforming. Then point number 3, in the letter that was then given to the bishops in Rome and which was then published, and then for the letter to God's people in Chile, Francis talks about a disconnection of God's people, and he tells the bishops that when the church in Chile used to put the Christ at the center, the church wasn't carrying out his evangelization task. It wasn't close to the people. It was humble in confessing its own sins. But then it took a distance from God's people. It took up a clerical mentality, and this led to desolation, to the incapability to really spread the gospel, and many other mistakes. So it was not so much the people who had abandoned the church, it was the contrary, it was the opposite. It was the church which had actually disconnected itself from the people. If the church does not evangelize, this is not a responsibility of the culture, it is the responsibility of the church itself. In a homily, in Aparecida, where the Pope talked about this wounded woman, it talks about a self-referential church, a church that looks at itself, and God's people is left on the other side. So this is, I believe, a key point. Pastoral conversion for Pope Francis starts with facing the truth and the confession of our sins. The accusation of oneself, says the Pope, is in a way very attractive to the devil, who in the end dies. So self-accusation means taking up the role of the culprit, as Jesus did, and it is a humiliating act that makes us be humble and leaves room for God's mercy. It changes us. It ends the mimetic power of the evil spirit. And this is what Francis did in the letter of the 8th of April, when he said, I was wrong, and I'm asking for your forgiveness. So in a way, it's a kind of self-accusation that the Pope is making with this letter, rather than self-justification or the idea of trying to make other people responsible. So, well, the consequences are to be seen in Chile at the moment. The bishops have made a heart of humility and acknowledged their mistakes, and they committed themselves to open up their archives. They try to reconnect with God's people, and they are ready to listen, to open up to the periphery. So this humiliation is generating a new form of humility, which is a pastoral conversion, which in the long term will bear fruits. And in his letter to the people of God, Francis says, never again to the culture of abuse. And I quote, in order to create a culture of attention that can actually penetrate our way to think and pray and live our authority, our habits, our language, our relationship with money and richness. Today, we know that the best thing we can say when we cause pain is the commitment to social conversion and self-conversion. So we need to learn how to listen to those who are vulnerable. So the church thus can once again evangelize, because people are called upon to experience the mercy of God and to generate a new culture. And in the Cathedral of Santiago, the Pope says the problem is not to be seen in feeding the hungry or help those who need help, but rather in realizing that poor people, suffering people, people who are homeless or in prison, they all have a dignity. They can all sit at our table and feel at home with us. So this is the sign that the heavenly kingdom is among us. The church has been wounded for its own sins, but it has received the mercy of God, and it has converted into a kind of a prophetical subject for its own vocation. And I would like to conclude by saying that of Chile is a very specific case, but it is in a way something that can explain the situation of the Western Church. Instead of reforming and understanding, we complained and condemned. The good news, however, are that by accusing ourselves, the opportunity of institutional humiliation, we have the chance to meet the God of mercy. That is the primary experience of the original evangelizing church. And from this starting point, we can really create a new culture, starting from the ruins of technocracy, a culture that can actually reflect the heaven, the kingdom of God. So this is the invitation of Pope Francis in this world that is going through a very dramatic change. Thank you for your attention.
Finalmente escuchamos a Massimo Borghesi.
And last but not least, we're going to give the floor to Massimo Borghesi, who's going to help us understand the intellectual process of Jorge Mario Bergoglio, and is opening to all the horizons offered by the European tradition, and integration between the European tradition and the Latin American tradition. How can the two traditions merge and can open up a new horizon for the universal church? Thank you very much. I'm really very happy to be here at the meeting and here with you all, and with the friends Carriquiry, Buttiglione, Ivereigh, and Alejandro Bonet, to present the thought and the figure of Pope Francis. I'm really very happy because next to me we have with us some of the leaders who have been focusing on Pope Francis in the intellectual world. Until recently, but still now, in a context where there were a lot of biases, where many people were hostile against the Pope. The commitment and support to clarify Pope's actions by the people who were sitting next to me have partly contributed to unease these tensions. Some people say that the Pope is an unfulfilled reformer. Some left-wingers say that because they're disappointed by what they thought the Pope would be. Until recently, they moved also allegations from the right. Allegations with a progressive Pope, Peronist Pope, populist Pope, and at the same time a pragmatic, pastoral Latin American Pope having no thoughts, which was unsuitable to be a Pope. The highest criticism was in spring 2016 with the publication of Amoris et Laetitia. That was a document on family. The cardinals expressed their doubts, saying that the Pope was heterodox, some people wanted the Pope to be impeached. Sheer folly. And that was amplified by bloggers, by people who didn't really understand anything, and all of a sudden had become theologians. They didn't know anything about the church tradition, about the canonic rites. They didn't know anything, but everybody turned into a theologian, like in the Byzantium of the 4th century. At that time, there was the idea to write a book on Bergoglio's thoughts, on the Catholic thought. And I insist, the Catholic thought by Bergoglio. Out of a conviction, which could be peculiar because up to 2016, not only those who criticized the Pope, but also the Pope's supporters didn't have any idea about how he developed intellectually. After I published my book on Bergoglio, I found many Bergoglio's supporters doubting that he really had intellectual training. They thought that he was just a pastoral pope, a good shepherd, but nothing more than that. On the contrary, 2 readings convinced me of a different thing. His writings in the 1970s, when Bergoglio was the youngest provincial of Argentinian Jesuits. They were translated into an Italian volume, Doctrine Sociale, by Jacobuc. So I read those documents, his writings, conferences. At that time, Bergoglio was 36 years old, who was leading the Society of Jesus at the dramatic times of the armed fight in Argentina. And those documents showed very original thoughts based on the tension of the opposed. And Bergoglio wanted to get church far away from the opposition between the left and the right, between the revolutionaries and the military. He didn't want to strike a balance. He wanted to have something dynamic, a dynamic church. And behind that, there was a thought. Existence was like living polarity. He was very similar to Guardini, but at that time he didn't quote Romano Guardini. So it was clear to me that when he was 36, Bergoglio had his original thoughts, Catholic thoughts. He was intellectual, very trained. And then there was another reading that persuaded me, that convinced me. It was a wonderful biography by Austen Ivereigh entitled The Great Reformer, Francis and the Making of a Radical Pope. It was published in New York in 2014. In Italian, the translation is somewhat different. It's a kind of softer version, Tempo di Misericordia, Vita di Jorge Mario Bergoglio, published by Mondadori. This is a biography which I recommend to you all, not because we've got Austen with us today, but because I do believe in that. It is the best biography ever. It is the best biography because it talks about Bergoglio in every possible way, and it doesn't just focus on Bergoglio and its Christian gestures, but also in his hesitations in his life and his intellectual training. The people who influenced him, the personalities that influenced him, the Argentinian culture, there's everything in this biography because he was working on field and went to Argentina. He interviewed the people directly. So this biography is really very interesting. Who wants to escape from common sense on the Pope has to read this biography. You cannot criticize Bergoglio without knowing who he really is and how he was trained. So I couldn't have written my book without this biography, because I wouldn't have had the basic information. So these two readings led to the idea that Bergoglio had a very Catholic thought. Hence, decided an idea of writing a book. So I stopped some other jobs and I started to write this book because there was a very dangerous attack against Bergoglio, a wide attack against the Pope in spring and summer 2016. And I had to do something. Where were the theologians at that time? The Catholic theologians in Italy and outside. Why should we have theologians if they don't do anything in cases like this? If theologians do not support the Pope, what should they do? What should they deal with? A layman published a book on Bergoglio's thought 4 years through his pontificate, and that was incredible. Nobody understood that Bergoglio had a wonderful and excellent intellectual training. Useless to say, useless to compare him with Ratzinger. And this thought was deeply rooted in the Latin American, Christian and European tradition. The allegations against Bergoglio to be a Latin American in terms of training shows deep ignorance. Bergoglio is both Latin American and European because he's Jesuit, and Jesuits are international in their training. He trained a lot on European French Jesuits, the School of Lyon, Henri de Lubac. And we talked about this here at the meeting with another friend, with Guzman Carriquiry. His wife and my wife were also present, and Guzman was immediately enthusiastic about it. And he was a sort of sponsor for me. He was my first reader. He was my connection with the Pope. So he played a very important role. This is why I want to thank him. In October, January, the book continued. I had collected all the materials and I made a lot of discoveries. I already knew many things, but I didn't know many others, especially on the Latin American and European roots of this very original and rich thought, which I cannot analyze here in detail today. I will just remind some of the people that have influenced him. The great philosopher, the biggest Argentinian philosopher of the 1970s, Amelia Podetti, that created the category of peripheries and the role of Latin America in the world geography and geopolitics. She had a vision of society and of history. And then Alberto Metol-Ferré also influenced him. We talked about him. He is the greatest Catholic intellectual of the second half of the 20th century in Latin America. I was lucky enough to meet him. And I had relations with him through my friend Albert Metalli. I hope he's present in the room. Albert Metalli is now working with Father Pepe and Paola in Buenos Aires. Albert Metaglia made a long interview, which lasted 1 year, to Alberto Metol-Ferré, entitled The Pope and the Philosopher, Il Papa e il Filosofo in Italian, which is very precious if you want to understand Alberto Metol-Ferré and his contribution to the Catholic Church teachings today, has to read this interview by Albert Metal. And then he was also Carriquiry's teacher. Rocco Buttiglione knew him very well. So it is a story that came to light after it had been forgotten. But why has this story been forgotten? We should ask ourselves, why has it been forgotten? Forgetting that story means not understanding the Pope. Had we realized about the story, we would have immediately understood who Bergoglio was. But the problem was that from some point onwards, the years of globalization, that history was forgotten. And then, in addition to Podetti and Metol-Ferré, the Jesuits, like de Lubac, de Certeau, who was an expert of mystics, also influenced Bergoglio. De Certeau is the author of a wonderful biography on Pierre Fabre, and he is Ignazio's companion, is the one going around, traveling around Europe, going through the religious wars and writing why, rather than killing each other, don't the Christians go back to the early unity? Because the problem was not intellectual, but was first of all the reform of the souls. The problem is spiritual. Pierre Fabre was sweet. He was meeting the people in power. He studied in La Sorbonne, but at the same time, he was taking care of the poor. It's not difficult to understand that Bergoglio, who canonized Pierre Fabre, is fully familiar with St. Ignazio's friend. Jesuits, de Lubac, de Certeau, von Balthasar influenced him. Bergoglio, since 2008-9, but even before that, used Balthasar for his idea of the symphony of the truth. The fact that the Church is universal and peculiar at the same time, universal and peculiar, particular at the same time. So it is enshrined in the culture of peoples, but it is not a nationalist. It is ecumenical. This idea is used by Bergoglio, and for Balthasar was also important for Pope Francis due to the idea of the beauty of the truth, the attractiveness of the truth. Christ is attractive. The Christian truth can be communicated starting from a beauty, because the good can only be followed if it is beautiful. The same applies to truth. Otherwise, there's the morale, formality. And then the truth must be attractive, just like the beauty. And then Father Giussani. Giussani was important for Bergoglio. And you can find a lot of information on that in the book. He also said that himself on 2 or 3 occasions. Giussani was very important for me. If you read what he said and wrote on Giussani, you can understand that he is pretty much in line with him, especially when talking about the meeting. Yesterday, the Apostolic Nuncio, Monsignor Pierre, remembered as Aparecida Evangelii Gaudium, talked about the sentence of Pope Benedict XVI: at the beginning of being Christians, there's no major idea nor ethical decision, but there is a meeting. Benedict's sentence comes from Giussani. So there's a sort of common links, there are commonalities between the latest popes and Father Giussani. All these contributions lead to a Catholic thought, embracing thought, a polyedrical thought. In the church, everyone can find its place, can find its role. Every one of us is enhanced. No one is excluded or marginalized. No one must be marginalized unless they want to be marginalized. The church is universal and peculiar and particular. The church must not level down diversity, must enhance diversity. Movements must not level down diversities, must enhance diversities inside the common unity. That means polarity. Bergoglio's thought is polar, combining limits and fullness, the idea and reality, localization and globalization, time and moment. These are the polar pairs. This is also said in Evangelii Gaudium, but that dates back to the 1970s. He has a table, Bergoglio has a table of polar categories applied to the society, the church, and the world. He has a thought. This thought makes us understand why Bergoglio in 1986 studied Romano Guardini when he went to Germany for his PhD thesis that he will never end. That thesis was on Guardini as a philosopher, focusing on polarity. Why was he interested in that? Because he already was interested in polarity. And Guardini confirmed his thoughts. Since then, Guardini became his master. He quotes him. He comments it. Guardini's model is applied to the society, to the church, to political events. Since 1986, Guardini played a fundamental role in Bergoglio's thought, in philosophy. In January 2017, I had almost finished my book, and there was still a pending issue, a pending question. Where did the idea of polarity come from Bergoglio? The only thing to do was to interview the Pope, and once again, my friend Carriquiry was very precious to me. The Pope answered a series of questions I asked him through 4 audio files, rich in remarks and discoveries. And the most important discovery was that the author who trained him in his youth and in his studies was a French Jesuit, Gaston Fessard. And one of his works in particular, the dialectics of spiritual exercises of Sant'Ignazio de Loyola. Why was he so much interested in this book? Because for the first time, he understood who the Christian was, the life of the Christian. And the life of the Christian is not passive, is not quiet. It is a dynamic life. Because the life of a Christian is characterized by a polar tension between the grace of God and the freedom of man. The grace always questions freedom. It makes it dynamic. And it is a polar tension between God and man. It is a fight between the two. Yesterday, we were read an excerpt by Falkowitz on Romano Guardini, the fight with the angel. It was a sort of fight with the angel, continuous fight with the angel. That was Ignazio. That was Ignazio's thought. The Christianity is drama. It goes beyond the fight against conservatives and the traditionalists. It was a prophecy and institution. A polar dramatic thought is a mystic thought which is open because the solution belongs to God. Man starts processes and God accomplishes them. And this is a thought based on tension. According to Bergoglio, the church enemy today is clericalism. As said in the interview by Tornielli, comes from the degradation of wonder. It is nurtured by the relation between grace and freedom. And this goes against the linear thought. And I quote Bergoglio. This is a sentence written to Bergoglio, to a journalist, Lucio Brunelli, that makes you understand the concept of Christian for Bergoglio. And I quote, in this linear thought, static thought, there's no place for delectatio and dilectio. There's no place for wonder, because the linear thought goes against grace. Grace is received, is a pure gift. The linear thought has to give, has to own. It cannot open up to a gift. It can only own. Delectatio and dilectio and wonder cannot be owned, can just be received, very simply. The essence of the Pharisees leaves no space for grace to come in. It is enough in itself. It is self-sufficient for a linear thought. On the contrary, the publican has a tensing thought, opening up to grace, has a conscience that is not enough, but is deeply begging. The Christian is a beggar. This is Bergoglio's thought. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for being with us this morning. So we have been trying to understand better what is happening. Thank you very much once again.